Wilmington, Delaware has always been a city with two sides. A place where family homes and corner stores sit just a block away from streets that carry a very different story. And in the early 2010s, one of those stories centered around a group that called itself the 30th Street Crew. Federal prosecutors would later say this crew was not just a loose collection of friends, but a structured drug trafficking organization that controlled a row house at 3000 North Madison Street, a location that stood only a short walk from a middle school, but operated like an open-air pharmacy. According to court records, the 30th Street Crew was led by a man named Shedar Miller, who was 34 years old when he finally stood before a judge, and who was described as the boss of a network that trafficked heroin, crack cocaine, powder cocaine, and marijuana across Wilmington. This house became the focus of federal and local law enforcement after neighbors reported constant traffic, cars circling the block, and hand-to-hand exchanges that rarely stopped. And the danger grew when shootings erupted outside the same home in November and December of 2011, confirming for investigators that the operation was not only fueling addiction, but also fueling violence in the neighborhood. Agents from the FBI and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, working alongside Wilmington Police, Delaware State Police, Newcastle County Police, Probation and Parole, and even the U.S. Marshals, started building a case that would take more than a year to complete. A case that relied heavily on wiretaps and surveillance. By March 2012, prosecutors say the conspiracy was fully active, with shipments of heroin coming from New York into Delaware. The main supplier, according to federal filings, was a man named Miguel Angel Diaz, a 40-year-old from the Bronx who had been trafficking drugs for years. Between June 2012 and June 2013, prosecutors later told the court, Diaz sent up to 200 logs of heroin to Wilmington twice a month, with each shipment worth between $40,000 and $70,000. Couriers carried the heroin into Delaware, where it was received by an associate of Miller's, and from there, the product flowed to Miller and his brother, Tamir Collins, and then down to the rest of the crew. These were not small amounts. Prosecutors said Miller admitted responsibility for at least 700 grams of heroin and admitted to buying cocaine in kilogram quantities, which the crew would then break down into smaller pieces for retail sale. On June 13, 2013, the investigation reached its breaking point. That morning, agents and officers swept into Wilmington and arrested Miller, along with 8 other members of the 30th Street Crew. They were held without bail, considered too great a risk to be released before trial. The indictment that followed listed 10 men: Miller himself, Albari Malik Johnson, Tamir Collins, Keenan Williams, Walter Thomas, Ibrahim Cisse, Andre Cephas, Harry Coverdale, Corey Pendergrass, and Daquan Riley. Over time, the number of defendants tied to the case would rise to 14 and eventually 15 once the supplier was included. As the court process moved forward, nearly all of those indicted decided to plead guilty rather than risk trial, with sentences for most falling in the range of 2 to 4 years, depending on their roles and criminal histories. Miller's younger brother, Tamir Collins, who was identified as a leader alongside him, was sentenced in April 2014 to 6 years in prison. Miller himself waited until July 25th, 2014, when he was sentenced in U.S. District Court to 78 months in prison, 6.5 years behind bars, followed by 4 years of supervised release. By then, he had already spent more than a year in custody, with the time he served since the June 2013 arrest credited toward his total sentence. The biggest sentence went to Diaz, the supplier, who was arrested at JFK International Airport in March 2014 when he returned for the Dominican Republic. In 2016, Diaz was sentenced to 121 months, just over 10 years, plus 5 years of supervised release, marking his second federal drug trafficking conviction. The evidence against the crew was not only physical, but also technological. Wiretaps caught coded conversations between Miller and his associates. Phone records showed regular contact with New York, and surveillance teams documented the flow of people in and out of the Madison Street house. The violence outside the home in 2011 added to the weight of the case, as prosecutors argued that the drug trade there had turned the property into a magnet for gunfire and a threat to families living nearby. The case demonstrated the way conspiracy law works. Under federal law, it is not only the person holding drugs who can be charged, but anyone who joins the agreement to distribute them. That meant that leaders, suppliers, and street-level sellers were all linked in the same conspiracy. By charging them together, prosecutors were able to dismantle the network from top to bottom. Officials later said that the 30th Street crew was a large-scale, violent drug trafficking organization that operated with near impunity until the investigation brought it down. The sentences reflected each man's place in the hierarchy. 2 to 4 years for lower-level members, 6 years for Collins, 78 months for Miller, and more than 10 years for Diaz. What stands out about the case is how organized the group became. They had a steady supplier, a fixed headquarters, and a chain of command. They had code words for shipments and runners who carried packages like clockwork. But no matter how careful they tried to be, the phones told the story, and the constant traffic told the neighborhood what was happening. For Wilmington, the fall of the 30th Street crew was another chapter in a long fight against drug crews that rise on corners, build reputations, and eventually collapse under the weight of surveillance and indictments. This was not a glamorous empire. It was a business run out of a row house, marked by phones buzzing with orders, cars circling the block, coded conversations about logs and weight, and finally, federal agents in dark SUVs pulling up with warrants in hand. In the end, the empire that once looked untouchable became just another closed case file in the federal courthouse. A reminder that the street may build names, but the law is always building cases.